All right, I'm excited to now lead us into this morning's big event, which is our keynote address by Amanda Rector. Amanda is the State Economist for Maine and has served in this role since 2011. Her work includes ongoing analysis of Maine's economic and demographic conditions to help inform policy decisions. And today she will help us connect the dots between education, the workforce, and the economy, and help us understand how we got here and what we can expect in the future. Please feel free to type questions using the chat feature during the keynote, as we do hope to leave time for Q&A with Amanda after her remarks. So we'll be compiling those from the chat all throughout the presentation, and we might have some opportunity for live questions if time allows. So I'm going to stop my screen share here, and we get to see each other, which is always a fun part. And welcome, Amanda. And I'm spotlighting Amanda, but you're welcome to go back up to your, the corner of your top right corner of your Zoom screen and return to gallery view if you prefer. But this will ensure that Amanda's on our front page. And welcome, hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I grew up in Camden, so the coast and the island communities are a very important part of me and my experiences. I live in Union now, so I'm a little bit inland, but my parents are still in Camden. I still get to go there on a regular basis. I am going to pull up my slide presentation here so that I can share with you lots of very exciting charts. I always feel bad when I do these presentations and I'm like, first thing in the morning, I'm like, and here are lots and lots of charts. But hopefully I'll be able to talk through them with you to have them make a little bit more sense and form a little bit more of a story for you. So I'm going to start out with what is really sort of the big picture. This is the total population for Maine going all the way back to 1820, so 200 years of Maine population. And you'll notice that we've had some periods where growth has been a little bit more rapid, some periods where growth has been a little bit slower. We do have the 2020 decennial census count, 1,362,359. And then there's a projection in here. That's that dotted line going out into the future. So I do these projections every couple of years. These are from 2018 data. That's sort of the end point for them. I have to wait a while before I can get all of the pieces of data I need to do the projections. So they're a little outdated at this point. The next time that I do my projections, I'll be jumping off of the 2020 data. So we will see hopefully an improvement, because you'll notice that these projections here are actually a little bit lower than where we are now. Our 2020 decennial census count for the state was actually higher than what we had been expecting based on the population estimates that had been coming out each year since the 2010 census. So I want to sort of take a regional look as much as I can. And so I've split the state into 6 regions, and you can sort of see on the map here. There's a southern coastal region, there's mid-coast, down east, northern. The central region is not really contiguous, but it's sort of the counties that are along the middle of the state, and then the western region here. So there were 7 counties that actually had their highest decennial population count in a year other than 2020. Now, a lot of them had their most recent count in 2010. So if we see some increased migration, we could see these peak again in maybe 2030. Generally speaking, you would expect population would increase over time. So those are mostly over in the western portion of the state here, plus Penobscot. And then the other counties that had their highest decennial count in a year other than the most recent one Aroostook County peaked all the way back in 1960, Piscataquis 1920, and Washington County all the way back in 1900. And all of these counties are sort of in the northern and down east portion of the state. Most of the population growth has been in the southern coastal and the central parts of the state. And really, particularly since about 1970, the bulk of the growth has been in the southern coastal part of the state. The other parts of the state really have not seen a huge change. Western has seen a little bit of an increase. That's the yellow, the green one. Orange here is the mid-coast region. You can see a little bit of an increase there. But by and large, the bulk of the growth has been southern coastal and central to some extent. So if you look again at the projections here, and as I said, these are based on 2018 data, so it's most obvious in the southern coastal region that these projections look quite a bit different from the trend that we have been seeing in the most recent decennial. And so when I redo these, hopefully that will change a little bit to reflect the more recent pattern. But the others, it really is this continuation of what we have been seeing, which is sort of minimal growth in the other parts of the state. Just to give you a snapshot of sort of where we are right now, I mentioned the 2020 decennial population. That makes Maine the 42nd largest state in the US. Our population change from 2010 to 2020 between the two decennial censuses was an increase of 2.6%. Interestingly, that is also the 42nd among the US states, and mostly sort of, I don't know, some Midwestern-y kind of states that we're ahead of. We do have one of our New England neighbors, Connecticut, is in that list as well. The median age from 2019 was 45 years. We don't have age data yet from the 2020 census. We're still waiting on that. That is, of course, the oldest in the US. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone anymore. We're actually the oldest by another count as well. We have the largest share of the population that is age 65 and older. We had been behind Florida for many years, and we surpassed Florida a couple of years ago. And then our population is 9.8% Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That is the lowest percentage in the US. It is improved from 5.6% in 2010, but we still lack a lot of the racial and ethnic diversity that the rest of the US has. So just to give you a better sense of that on a regional basis, even the parts of the state that are a little bit more diverse, the southern coastal region, the central region, and to some extent down east, we still are really, really much less diverse than the nation as a whole. So again, as I said, this has been improving over time. And in fact, most of the population growth in the past decade has come from all of these diverse races and ethnic groups. But it still has a long way to go to sort of catch up to where the US as a whole is in terms of some of this racial and ethnic diversity. If we look at age by region, the southern coastal part of the state and the central part of the state, again, are sort of the two regions that are a little bit younger. You'll notice, so this is the percent in different age cohorts. So the top here is 65 plus, the green is 45 to 64. So you'll see the 50% mark here. So Southern Coastal has a little bit less than half of the population that's age 45 and older. And then there are a few regions here where more than half of the population is age 45 and older. And so this is certainly gives you a better sense of what that age breakdown looks like between sort of the age cohorts here. And you can see 5 to 13, 14 to 17, relatively small parts of the population. And in fact, this 65 plus has been increasing over time. If we look at the median age, so again, this is 2019, we're still waiting for 2020, but here's the statewide median at 45 years. So Androscoggin County, Cumberland County, Penobscot County, and Kennebec County, just by a hair, down below the statewide median. So what do those counties have in common? Well, they have our slightly more urban areas. We don't have really urban areas here in Maine, but they have what we consider more urban areas. And they also have a large college and university presence. So those bring in a lot more younger people and bring that median age down. Now, there are a couple of counties here, Piscataquis County, Lincoln County, that are well above the statewide median and actually have median ages up above 50. So why are we the oldest state? Well, we also have the largest percentage of baby boomers in our population of any state. So baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. So here's a population pyramid for Maine from 1950. Each one of those bars represents the percent of the population in a particular age sex cohort. So 1950, baby boomers were just starting to be born. So the base of this pyramid, the under 5, is very, very wide. That's the largest. And then 85 plus, not a lot of people living beyond the age of 85 back in 1950. So this is a very, very small percentage. So it essentially looks like a pyramid, hence the name. So if we move forward through a few decades here, you'll notice that there is this bulge that is moving up through the years, and that is the baby boom cohort. And I'm going to stop at 2019 for a second here because this is the most recent data that we have. You'll notice there's this bulge of baby boomers that is now starting to move into traditional retirement years. And we've been accumulating more people up at the very, very top here because life expectancy has been increasing over time. But down below, we don't have the same population moving into the workforce as we have exiting the workforce. There is a little bit of a secondary bulge here. It's a little bit hard to see because it's not very big, but essentially those are the children of the baby boomers. There were so many baby boomers that even though birth rates were lower, it still caused another boomlet in the population. That's essentially the millennial generation. So if we move ahead through the projections, 2028, you'll notice as the baby boomers are continuing to age, we're accumulating more and more of our population up at the top of this pyramid to the point now where it's starting to look like we've reversed that pyramid. We now have a more top-heavy population. One of the things that I have been asked a lot in the past few months is, wow, home sales have been crazy. Does this mean that we're going to have a big population boom from people moving into the state? And my answer is, I don't know. Essentially, we just don't have the right information to tell us who the people are who have been buying these homes and how long they're planning on staying or what they're planning on doing with those homes. So certainly while the units sold and the median sale price have been increasing dramatically, the Maine Realtors noted in their September press release, there was a 12% increase in single family home sales from January through August of this year compared to last year, and a almost 15% increase in the median sales price in August compared to a year ago. And out-of-state buyers are representing a larger share of those transactions, but it could very well be that these are people who are retirees who are looking to buy a second home, or maybe they're looking to buy a home that they'll primarily rent out during using short-term rental platforms. We don't necessarily know whether these are people who are moving here long-term with their family. Are they planning on just sort of holding out until the pandemic is over and then going back to where they came from? We just don't have that information yet. I will say that the increase in home sales, particularly if it is driven more by retirees, seasonal housing, more of the short-term rentals, this is problematic from a workforce housing perspective. We already had a challenge finding affordable housing for people. And if you look across here, so this is the June through August quarter of this year compared to last year. The sales have slowed a little bit in July and August, primarily due to the fact that there hasn't been the available inventory. So some of these are down from a year ago, but still a lot of increases. And if you look at the sales price, those have been increasing across the board. The only one that did not have double-digit percentage growth was Washington County. And even that saw an increase in the sales price. So what this is doing is really putting a lot of pressure on the affordability of homes. So this is a chart showing the percentage of households unable to afford the median home. So the green counties here are essentially the counties that are still considered affordable. All of those in red were unaffordable, and this was 2020. So it's not taking into account all of that additional price pressure that's happened so far this year. And more of these, some of these counties were not that far from this 50 percentage point mark, which is sort of the tipping point between affordable, unaffordable. And so we could very well see more of our counties moving into that unaffordable territory, which is going to make it even harder to attract the younger workforce that we're going to need. And we're going to need that because of all of the demographics that I was just talking about. So this is a chart coming from the Department of Labor's employment outlook to 2028. So again, it's based on 2018 data, a little outdated. We do these every couple of years. The percentage, the bars here represent the numeric change in population by different age cohorts. So you can see a big increase in the age 65 plus. That's essentially the baby boomers continuing to move into that age cohort, and then decreases, large decrease in the 55 to 64 as the baby boomers are moving out of those years, and the 45 to 54. So the problem is that if we look at those population changes compared to this employment to population ratio, we're essentially trading population at higher employment to population ratios. That ratio is really just the percentage of your adult population that is employed. So very, very high ratios, up 80%, 70% for 45 to 54, 55 to 64. That drops all the way down to about 20% for 65 plus. Now, certainly in the early years of that category, 65, 66, 67, you still have a lot of people who are employed, but that drops off very, very rapidly as you start to move into 70, 75, 80. And so this mix here is contributing to a future workforce shortage where we don't have the population moving into these high employment to population ratio years, but we have a lot moving out into this lower employment to population ratio. So what is this doing to our actual labor force? This chart shows the Maine labor force for the whole state, going all the way back to 1947. And immediately your attention is drawn to this period in the middle here, going from about the late 1960s through to about 1990, where there was very, very rapid labor force growth. And there were a couple of things going on. We had the baby boomers aging into their prime working age years. We had some pretty good migration into the state, primarily of baby boomers. And we had women joining the labor force in much larger numbers than they had before. So a sort of perfect storm that led to this really rapid labor force growth. And then it slowed a little bit. It was still growing, but not quite as quickly. And then we hit about 2004, 2005, and the labor force essentially plateaued and now has started to trend down. That last data point here is the pandemic. So you can see what a big drop there was in 2020 in terms of the labor force. And this labor force trend here really is completely dependent on that demographic data that I shared earlier and this aging of the population that we're experiencing. If we break it down by region, remember that southern coastal, so this is a shorter time frame here, this just goes back to 1990. That southern coastal part of the state where we've seen so much more population growth, we have not seen quite the same growth in the labor force. It has been growing, but not to the same point. And again, 2020, you can see it ticked down pretty much across the board in all of the different regions here. The southern coastal part of the state really is the only region during this time period that has seen growth in the labor force. The other regions all pretty much flat in terms of the labor force from 1990 through to 2020. So I want to talk a little bit about what's been going on more recently in terms of the unemployment rate and the pandemic. So in April of 2020, Maine's official unemployment rate was 9.1%. So if you look at this chart here, Maine is in blue. All the way over to the left, there's another little blue peak, just that very first peak. That is February of 1977. That was the other time we hit 9.1%. So even though this was essentially tied for a record high unemployment rate, it actually undershot the true unemployment rate. There were some technical issues around how the survey was being conducted, who was being considered unemployed versus out of the labor force. So it really would have been even higher than this. So the Department of Labor has been doing an estimation saying, okay, if labor force participation, which we know came down a lot during 2020, if labor force participation were back at pre-pandemic levels, what would the unemployment rate be? In August, the official unemployment rate was 4.9%. This unofficial estimate is 8.4%. So still very, very elevated because labor force participation is so much lower. Now, there are a number of reasons why labor force participation may have declined. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I did want to just share this is the August unemployment rate across the counties. And so you can see, generally speaking, that southern coastal, mid-coast region tends to have lower unemployment rates, particularly, so these are not seasonally adjusted, particularly during the summer. Tourism is a big economic driver through a lot of that region. And so the summer months tend to have much lower unemployment rates, with the Western and Northern and Washington County having higher unemployment rates. There was a really interesting survey that Department of Labor released the results from just a few weeks ago. They surveyed unemployment claimants and active job seekers on the barriers to return to work. And the most commonly cited barriers were lack of opportunities that match my skill set and COVID health risks or concerns. The pandemic is still playing a big role in people's ability to be in the labor force and to be working. Other reasons: concerns about job quality, inaccessibility of opportunities. Maybe somebody lives somewhere, has a particular skill set. There are opportunities, but they're not where that person is living. Lack of social supports, childcare, transportation. Of those who did return to work, the things that helped them get back to work, their previous employer rehired them, and finding a job that matched their skill set. So this job matching is a really, really important part of what's going on in terms of the recovery from the, recovery from the pandemic. So lack of opportunities that match the skill set is a barrier. Finding a job that matches the skill set, one of the things that gets you back to work. If we look at the share of employment by industry, this is 2020, the shares, roughly speaking, are about the same despite the pandemic. The levels are a little bit lower in some places. So trade, transportation, and utilities, most of that is retail trade. That is the largest employment sector, followed by healthcare and social assistance. As you might imagine, as our population continues to age, healthcare is an increasingly important part of that. Government, little misleading, government includes federal, state, and local, and it includes all of the public education, K through 12, community college, public university. So all of that is in this government category here. It's much broader than it might initially seem. Professional and business services has been an increasingly important part of Maine's economy. That covers a whole slew of different types of businesses, everything from temp agencies to law firms to architecture, all sorts of different things. And then leisure and hospitality and manufacturing, still both very important industries in the state. Leisure and hospitality clearly took a big hit in terms of the employment from the pandemic. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. If we look at the share of employment by industry across those regions, the education and health services is a very big sector across here. This is a slightly different data set. Trade, transportation, and utilities is behind that. So this education and health services includes that portion of the government that was in education. It's moved into a different one in this particular source, which is why that bumps up so much higher. There are a couple of regions that look a little bit different when you start to look at some of the other sectors. So the western part of the state, the northern part of the state, higher shares of manufacturing in those parts of the state. I will say southern coastal, this manufacturing share is likely even higher. Essentially, there's some suppressed data because of a very large employer in Bath that shows up in the manufacturing sector. So if we look at where we lost jobs during the pandemic, so this is the net change in jobs from February through to August. So it incorporates both the declines and then the recovery thus far. Leisure and hospitality, as I said, far and away the hardest hit, still down about 12,000 jobs. Local government, state government, that's primarily the education component of those. This is back to that education is part of government data source. Healthcare and social assistance. Most of this is coming from the childcare part of this. Childcare shows up in the social assistance category here. The other thing that I want to point out is that most of those are some of our lower wage jobs as well. If we look up at those sectors that have fully recovered and are close to fully recovering, professional business services, wholesale trade, federal government, private education, some of those tend to be the higher average wage sectors. Now, it's not uniform across the board, but by and large, sort of the ones construction on up, which have come back mostly to where they were pre-pandemic, those have more of the high wage jobs in them. I will also point out that the average weekly wage increased pretty substantially from 2019 to 2020. As businesses have struggled to find workers, one of the first things you do if you're a business and you can't find enough workers, you offer them more money to come and work for you. Pretty basic economics right there. And so we've seen average wages increasing. If we shift to look at occupational employment, so industry employment is the type of work that a business does. Occupational employment is the type of work that an individual does. Office and administrative support is still a very big piece here. Sales and related, and again, as you might imagine, in the Mid-Coast region where tourism is so important, that retail sales component is pretty strong there. There are a couple of differences, and I will share a link when I finish talking. I'll share a link that takes you to this slideshow so that you can peruse this at your leisure, because I crammed a lot of stuff onto some of these charts, and so you're probably going to want to go back at some point and sit down and puzzle through exactly what all of this looks like if you're interested. But just to give you a sense of the mix of different occupations that are out there and how that does vary across the regions. Food preparation and serving related, higher in the western part of the state. You've got some construction and installation, maintenance and repair, some educational instruction that are big pieces here, production, that's sort of the manufacturing types of jobs. Again, western region, not surprising there, and northern, that's a larger share as well. Looking forward, so the Department of Labor produces, as part of their job outlook, a look at occupational growth as well. So these are the 25 occupations with the largest projected net job growth for the state as a whole. And if you go to the Department of Labor's website and look for their jobs outlook, you can go and play around with this. I took this directly from their website, and you can see, you can pick largest openings, fastest rate of job growth. And it also has the educational requirement in here, which is sort of the typical education required for these particular ones. You'll notice personal care aides, registered nurses, medical assistants, nurse practitioners, medical secretaries, lots of the healthcare related jobs showing up here. Combined food preparation and serving workers. So that food related leisure and hospitality sector, restaurant cooks. Software developers. So that tech tech sector is an increasingly important part in terms of the job growth that is expected in the state. Financial managers, there is quite a mix here. If we look across the regions, we have a slightly different measure here. This is the largest projected annual openings. So this gets at the idea that even if you're not seeing a lot of job growth, net growth, new jobs being created, there's still a tremendous amount of churn that takes place where there are jobs that are constantly turning over and needing more people to fill them. And so you'll notice a lot of these top sort of projected openings don't require any particular formal educational credential. A lot of the waiters and waitresses, retail salespersons, cashiers. I will say that a lot of those jobs are also ones that are tending to move more towards automation. And so some of this, while this is based on sort of recent trends, some of this may change as we see more restaurants, for example, instead of getting a new wait staff, having you order an iPad at your table and then you go and collect it from a counter, things like that. So automating some of these jobs. Retail sales, we're doing more and more shopping online. That means you need fewer people standing in a physical store. I will say, so this is coastal counties region. These are regions that the Department of Labor has. And again, you can actually see the map if you're on their website. This is the coastal counties region here. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these. Again, this is something that you probably want to go and look at on your own. The regions are similar. There is a little bit of variation in terms of what some of these larger ones are, but you do see some of these nursing assistants, tractor trailer truck drivers. If you've been paying attention to the supply chain woes of recent weeks and months, the lack of truck drivers is a big part of that. So definitely a wide variety of occupations between those largest net growth occupations and this turnover in occupations, sort of the churn that happens every year. I also wanted to point out they publish a list of these high wage in-demand jobs. So they're combining not just there are going to be a lot of openings, but these are jobs that also have higher wage levels. And these certainly there's a little bit more of a variation in terms of the education required here. More of these are requiring a bachelor's degree, some sort of post-secondary. The truck drivers, you've got to get some licensing around that. Again, lots of this is showing up in some of those larger sectors, registered nurses, general and operations managers, retail sales workers. But again, there is a variation here. And I will also say that a lot of these jobs have a lot more of a technology component than you might think. So in many cases, the kinds of work that people are doing in these occupations, the occupational title may not have changed, but the actual work they're doing with it, they may be spending much, much more time on a computer than they would have in the past. So if we look at educational attainment briefly across these counties here, and these are the regions that I had on the map at the beginning, you can see again, there's some pretty good variation. So southern coastal here. So if you look at, I guess the easiest way to think of this is if you lump the green and the blue at the top here together, that's bachelor's degree or higher. And so you can see a larger share of the southern coastal has at least a bachelor's degree, about 40%. The northern and the western regions have a smaller share, only about 20% with a bachelor's degree or higher. And so a different mix of that educational attainment, in addition to those slightly different mixes of industries and occupations that we saw earlier. And again, many of those different occupations around manufacturing tend not to require, or at least certainly in the past, didn't require having a bachelor's degree or graduate degree. And so some of that sort of shows up as you're looking at this educational attainment data. If we look ahead on the employment forecast, this comes from the state's Census Economic Forecasting Commission. That's a group of 5 independent economists. They're not a part of the legislature or the executive. They come from academia and private and nonprofit. They get together a couple times a year and set the official economic forecast for the state. We then take that and use that in our revenue forecast, which in turn sets the state budget. So this is the very important first part of that process. And so you'll see that we had, so here was our Great Recession, pre-Great Recession peak way back in 2007, what we thought was a really big decline in employment, a gradual increase. We finally reached that pre-recession peak, grew on that pretty well for a few years. We reached a new peak in 2019, 637,000. And then 2020, a really, really big decline, almost taking us back to those Great Recession lows, just a little bit higher. The forecast here is that this year, 2021, we'll see some really robust employment growth, followed by some fairly good growth the year after that, 2022, with slowing growth in those years to come. We return to that peak sometime around 2023. This pattern of slowing growth in the out years is one that they've had for some time. Actually, they for many years were actually just flatlining that out year growth because of the demographics and because of that labor force trend that we saw. If you're not adding more people to your labor force, it's, really, really hard to increase your employment. So if we're looking at the forecast here, unless and until we see more population growth, particularly among younger workers, this employment growth in the out years is going to be hard to bring that growth up. I will say that this forecast is from April 1st. They're meeting again the end of this month to do a reforecast. So it'll be very interesting to see what they do with their 2021 and 2022 employment forecast in particular. They also do a projection or a forecast of personal income. So this is total personal income for the state as a whole. And so it's not just like an individual income or household income, it's the whole state. These are growth rates, they are adjusted for inflation. And then wage and salary disbursements are, generally speaking, the largest component of total personal income. So I've plotted that on this as well. You can see 2020, we had okay growth in wage and salary disbursements, despite all of those employment losses. Remember, I said a lot of those were on the low end. So overall, wage and salaries actually grew in 2020. And then we had a lot of federal stimulus that came in. And so that boosted overall personal income growth to a very, very high level, 6.5%. So the wage and salary forecast here is for pretty steady growth along through the years. Total personal income next year, there's still some pretty good growth built in, and that's on top of all of the growth that we had last year. So next year, when all of that federal stimulus has essentially unwound, there isn't the expectation that there will be more stimulus checks going out. A lot of the unemployment has ended. All those federal programs ended at the beginning of September. And so we'll actually, once you account for inflation, see total personal income growth turn negative before recovering back to sort of traditional growth rates. And that is because of all of that federal money unwinding. The wage and salary growth won't be enough to offset all of those declines. I talked about this, the fact that because we had fewer jobs and higher total wages, we saw the average wage per job increase really sharply in the pandemic era. So the green line here is average wage adjusted for inflation. You can see pretty flat. Every once in a while, there's a little bit of a jump up. Grew a little bit more in recent years, and that really was because we had such a tight labor force, that labor force essentially being flat, and we had employment growth. People were looking for more workers, and trying to find workers meant that they were trying to increase wages as well. So the pandemic period really has bumped those wages up very sharply. We've seen very strong growth in average wage per job over the past year or so. I want to turn just briefly to household income. This varies quite a bit depending on what part of the state you're in. So Cumberland County, of course, as you might imagine, is home to Portland, has the highest median household income, up over 70,000. And in fact, the 3 counties here that are up over 60,000, that's that southern coastal part of the state. And then you have some of the mid-coast and the central region. And then at the low end here, you've got Piscataquis County, Aroostook, Washington County, just a little bit north of 40,000. So a tremendous amount of variation in the household income. And again, that is very closely related. If you think back to the chart I had about educational attainment, a lot of correlation between those, in addition to those occupations and industries. So this next chart here, I've taken the state's GDP, gross domestic product for Maine, and split it out by region. So you can see sort of which regions of the state make up most of Maine's GDP value added. Sort of this is a very rough approximation of what people think of as the economy. I would argue for many reasons it's not a great measure of that, but it is one that is pretty recognizable and a lot of people use. So the southern coastal part of the state, remember, just those 3 counties, that makes up almost half of the state's GDP, and that's been increasing a little bit over time. It was about 46% back in 2001. It's up to about 49% now. And then if we look at the central region, again, you've got Lewiston, Auburn, you've got Augusta, Waterville, you've got Greater Bangor. Those are all in the central region. So it makes sense that that's the next largest. That's another quarter, little more than a quarter. So then the rest of the state, you can see about 7%, 6%, 5% for the remaining shares here, pretty much evenly divided between those remaining regions. If we look at GDP by industry, then immediately you see this big highest sector in the middle. That is finance, insurance, and real estate. And it's a little misleading because of the way that they measure real estate. So I'm going to tell you to essentially ignore that particular sector because it's not really apples to apples with the rest of them. Just to the right of that is professional and business services. I mentioned earlier on how this has been an increasingly important part of Maine's economy. You can see how GDP has increased very dramatically and steadily over the years. A little bit of a decline in 2020, but this has become a larger and larger share of our GDP. All the way over to the right, that's government and government enterprises. Again, I said that includes all of your public education. That's why that is so large. You can see that healthcare and social assistance, which is the 4th one in from the right, had some very steep increases. It slowed for a little bit. It started to pick up again more recently. Took a pretty big hit in 2020. And again, I said daycares, childcares are part of that sector. Just to the right of that is arts, entertainment, and recreation. And you can see that that really just got hammered by the pandemic and knocked all the way back essentially to Great Recession levels there. Over to the left, you can see trade, mostly retail trade, is another large share of the state's GDP. And manufacturing to the left of that, still a very important part of the economy, and has actually been increasing again. I think we often hear a story of manufacturing declines, and actually in recent years, manufacturing has been increasing again in terms of GDP. So let me try to connect some dots from all of those charts that I just shared, and hopefully through to some of the other conversations you'll be having over the next couple of days, later today in particular. So I talked about the fact that we have this aging population. That really means that we need to be creative in how we expand our available workforce. It means we need to attract more workers to the state. But it also means that we need to make sure that the workers we already have here are able to fully engage in the economy. So let me talk about attract more workers first. One of the things that has been sort of interesting to think about in terms of this worker attraction has been the ability for people to work remotely. And that actually was a conversation we were having even before the pandemic. More and more people were starting to move here and work for companies that were located elsewhere, because who wouldn't want to live in Maine? The ability to do your work for whatever company from a beautiful location here in Maine is very, very appealing for a lot of people. Not everybody by any means, but for many, many people. Broadband, high-speed internet access is an absolutely crucial part of that. What has happened in the past 18 plus months has been we've all had a crash course in remote work, or at least many, many of us have. And for a lot of people, they've realized that that is something that they feel comfortable doing. And it's something that they would like to continue doing after we sort of return back to a more of whatever is post-pandemic. It's not really returning, it's moving ahead to whatever is post-pandemic. And so there is perhaps an ability for more people to work remotely. Now, the two things I'll say about that. One, actually three things. One is that if you are doing sort of a hybrid work where you have to be in the office a couple days a week, it makes it much harder to locate wherever. You still have to be within commuting distance of your office. If we move towards a full remote type of employment, then that means you can be wherever. This can be beneficial if you think, well, how is that going to help our workforce if we have all of these people who are moving here, but they're working for places somewhere else? Well, in many cases, we have had people who, if you have a two-earner household, maybe one person has found a job here and the other can't because their expertise or skill set is in a job that we just don't have that many of. They could potentially work remotely. And then we also pick up the person who wasn't able to move here before because they had to be with their partner who was unable to find a job here. So it can help in terms of some of those dual earner households. I will also say that for companies that are based here, this sort of newfound appreciation for remote work means that you can also then look for workers who are located elsewhere. And so that takes some of the burden off of finding people who have to come to your place of employment. And instead, you can sort of cast a wider net for employees. In terms of making sure the workers we already have are able to fully engage in the economy, that means that people who are older workers, maybe we look at changing the type of work that they're doing so they're able to engage in it longer. Maybe they decide they want a new career. Maybe they want more flexible work hours. People who are in some of the traditionally sort of less connected to the workforce groups. So veterans, people with varying abilities, people of color. Some of those groups have had traditionally higher unemployment rates and a harder time connecting to the workforce. We're going to want to make sure that we can get all of them fully engaged in the economy because we're going to need everyone we can to be working so that we can continue to grow the economy. That also means that we need to make sure that people have the skill sets to engage in sort of some of the new economic opportunities that are out there. The state has a 10-year economic development strategy that outlines, workforce is a big part of that. It outlines some of the parts of the economy that are good opportunities for the future. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that next. So looking ahead to the jobs of the future, because while yes, we want people to be employed now, we also more importantly want to make sure that we are training people and providing them with the skills that they need to be employed in the future. Maine is actually well positioned to take advantage of some of the trends that are out there globally. And there are many, many different skill sets that are needed with many different pathways to engagement. So I mentioned the 10-year economic development strategy. There are sort of 4 thematic areas of the economy where there are global trends of more interest in these areas, and Maine already has an advantage in some of these. So food and marine, forest products, technical services, making and manufacturing. And within those areas, if you take forest products, for example, you need somebody to cut down trees and process the trees, but then you also need people who are developing the products that are coming out of it in new ways. So cross-laminated timber, using forest products as some of the energy sources of the future, using forest products in things like medical applications. There is a whole slew of different types of work that are involved in these different sectors. And those encompass a very broad range of different skill sets and opportunities. And then I just wanted to wrap up with sort of in the short term. So the COVID pandemic has had disparate impacts on sectors, on regions and populations. I haven't talked quite as much about some of that because I was trying to talk about some longer term trends as well. But in terms of the populations, if you think about those sectors that were hardest hit, leisure and hospitality, childcare, education, those sectors tend to employ larger shares of women. And mothers in particular have been hard hit because they have had to pick up more of the share of childcare as there have been limited access to childcare in sort of childcare facilities. And education has been, unfortunately, in sort of a hybrid situation in many cases. Mothers have been picking up a larger share of that. So women, mothers in particular, people of color, younger workers, and those are lower wage jobs as well. So lower income households have been much, much harder hit. Some of that is disguised. If you look at just the top level, employment or GDP or income, you think, oh, income, wages and salaries grew, everybody's okay. Well, it really depends on who you are and where you're working. A lot of things have changed. I was sharing the survey results from the Department of Labor, which give you a little sort of inkling of the fact that one of the challenges was around job quality. People are sort of taking this opportunity to reevaluate what they're doing, how they're doing it, what their values are in life. And so I think that the longer we spend in this environment where we've sort of had to rethink how we do things and have had the opportunity to reevaluate a lot of what we were doing, the longer we spend with the adaptations that we've made, the more likely some of those things like remote work, like people realizing that they actually enjoy spending time with their family and children and maybe don't want to just work all the time, that maybe the type of work they were doing before just sort of burned them out and they need to do something different with their life. Those changes are more likely to stick around the more time we spend in that environment living those changes. And so I think that we're at this moment now where the type of work that we're doing, the type of skills that are needed, how people are being compensated for their work, all of that is changing very rapidly. And so trying to account for that is going to be hard because it's going to take a lot of sort of thinking ahead to not just long-term trends, but also short-term, how are we recovering from this? But I think that it's an exciting moment too, because it does give us the chance to rethink some of the things that we had been doing for so long, just because that was the way that we had been doing them. And so when you stop and you do things differently for a while, it gives you an opportunity to think about things differently. And I think that's going to be beneficial in the longer run. So hopefully I've left a couple minutes for questions. This is my contact information. Feel free, you can send me an email if you have questions further on down the line. I also put the link to our website in here. We publish all of the presentations that I give, and I'll put a link in the chat to this slide deck directly. although you can also find it just going to our website and to the releases section. But we also publish monthly economic indicators reports that have a variety of different data, some of the stuff that was in the slides, but some other things too. If you're interested in sort of seeing what we're looking at as we're tracking the economy in sort of the more real-time terms, what we're considering, we post those, and other information is there as well, some of the census data, for example. So thank you very much. I'm going to take down the share. And if there's time for questions, and if anyone has questions, I would be happy to take those. And I will, as I said, put the link to the slides in the chat.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And this is the part where I, in a big room, we would all the appreciation, but I know that a bunch of questions did come through, and we have a little bit of time. And so I'm going to take some of the ones that came into the chat, and we'll see if we have any time for live ones in addition. You did answer, you were right that the question about the real estate demands and the increase in the population, that was a question, but you answered it during your presentation, so thank you. And another question was, do the projected job growth numbers take into account an entire career span? This person imagines that healthcare jobs will be in high demand for the next 20 years, but what about after that? Will we see high numbers of healthcare workers struggling with employment in their later careers? Will it be kind of a reverse trend as the baby boomer population decreases, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So employment outlook, the occupational outlook, is just a 10-year period. And like I do with my population projections, they update them every 2 years. And they're really based on recent trends. And so I would imagine that as we do sort of get past this bulge of baby boomers needing more care as they grow older, those projected numbers are probably likely to decrease further on down the line. But I will also say that that's quite a bit down the line at this point. And it's really hard to judge. There are so many things that could happen between now and then that it's really hard to judge exactly what the world will look like in 20, 30 years. If we think back to 20 years ago, I don't think anybody would guess that the world looks like it does today. I will say that in terms of sort of thinking about career jobs and career skills and career employment, one of the things that is increasingly important and increasingly apparent in the current economy is that there really isn't a career job anymore. You're constantly going to have to be upskilling, reskilling, learning more, changing as the economy and as jobs change around you. And so maybe you have the same job title for your whole career, but the kind of work that you're going to be doing is very likely to be changing over the course of that career. And so you're going to need to be doing this sort of lifelong learning much more than previous generations had. It used to be, you learned your skill set, you graduated, and then you went to your work and you used that skill set for your career. And that's just not the case anymore. And I can't imagine that the pace of change is going to slow. I can only imagine that if anything, it's going to accelerate even more, and we're going to have to be changing our skill sets on even more of a regular basis.
Kind of related to that, Lisa Shaw from the Maine State Library had a question around all the work being done on micro-credentials. And she noticed the American Community Survey numbers don't seem to reflect those, whether micro-credentials were obtained or required for work. So are they categorized as something else in the numbers shown, or do you expect they will start to either be included or shown separately in future numbers?
Yeah, the Census Bureau, as you might imagine, for something like the American Community Survey, it takes a very, very long time for them to adapt and change the questions to reflect sort of current realities. And certainly the micro-credentialing, I think, is a trend that makes a lot of sense if you think about that sort of rapid change in necessary skills. Those micro-credentials are a great way to try to reflect that, yes, I'm keeping up with the changing skills needs. So I would hope that at some point the census does start incorporating that into some of their American Community Survey data. It's not there now, and that makes it very, very hard to get good information on that, because we rely so much on some official data sources like the Census Bureau. If something like that isn't in there, it's really hard to go track down some good, reliable data on that. So hopefully at some point they will start doing some inclusion of micro-credentialing in their educational attainment data. I don't imagine that it will be in the very near term, but I would like to be pleasantly surprised.
Well, we will. It's a good little pitch for the 10:15 panel. We will have somebody from the Maine Community Colleges talking about micro-credentialing for digital skills. But let's see, a couple more questions to squeeze in. One question from Mary Ellen Bell. Are you looking at using other 21st century / climate change economic measurements as you track Maine's economy? She says, I don't know what these might be, but I've heard of other such measurements being used in Europe.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest challenge is that in terms of the data that we have access to, it just doesn't do a good job of reflecting that yet. I think Europe is well ahead of us in terms of acknowledging and measuring climate change and figuring out how to incorporate that into some of the measures. Certainly, I mean, it's absolutely something that we think about, and the Climate Council has done a lot of work on this, and there are a lot of policies that are being implemented to try to keep us ahead of it. But in terms of the measurement piece of that, yeah, it's still really hard. I don't have great data sources for that. So it's at least at this point much more of just trying to make sure we keep it in mind, and hard to reflect actual numbers on it.
Cool. All right. I'm squeezing these in. I don't think we're going to get to quite all of them, but a really quick one maybe is, do those wage increases parallel Maine's minimum wage increases in recent years?
So what's been happening with the minimum wage increases is that by and large, certainly as we've the past year or two, maybe has had a little bit more of an impact, but quite honestly, the wage increases that were happening were really pushing wages up even without the minimum wage increasing, because the labor market was so tight that people were having to increase wages anyway. Certainly that has contributed a little bit of upward pressure on the bottom, but if you look at the number of people to whom that minimum wage was applying, particularly the first couple of years, there were very, very few workers who were at that low minimum wage level. Much more of the recent upward pressure on wages has come simply from the labor market itself. I think that post-pandemic, it will be interesting to see what happens in terms of the wage growth and how much that minimum wage plays into wage growth in the future.